Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered here on Treaty 4 territory, the ancestral land of the Cree, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis. My name is Melissa Shaw, and I'm the General Manager of Cultural and Aquatic Services. Just some quick housekeeping items for everyone. Our washrooms are just located through the gift shop and towards the back hallway there. And recycling and garbage are over by the servery. I would like to thank the City of Swift Current, Sask Culture, and Sask Lottos for supporting programs like this. A very special thank you to the Saskatchewan Writer Guild and to Culture Days Grant for allowing us to bring Marion all the way from Saskatoon to speak with us again today. Also, a big thank you to Cynthia Starchuk for loaning us these many of her family's beautiful items, as you'll see displayed around the museum today. Our supper last night and our lunch today was delicious, and the borscht smells delicious, has been catered by House of Heart Cafe in Carery. A huge thank you to Paulette and her mother, Elaine, for the amazing food, and then Corla for helping get it ready again today. A few other quick notes. Our temporary exhibit just opened yesterday. It's called Enemy Aliens. It's pictures and stories about internment camps in Canada during World War I. And it will be here until the end of the year. Another quick housekeeping note for those of you who attend our Lunch and Learns. Starting in January, our Lunch and Learns are going to shift to the third Wednesday of the month, just to kind of change up some scheduling and give us some flexibility some elsewhere. So just for those of you who are always used to the second Wednesday, be ready for it to switch to the third. And our Lunch and Learn in November is going to be John Griffin, and he is going to be talking on researching World War II ancestries, and that will be on November the 8th. Without further ado, I am so excited to introduce Marion Mutala to speak to us. She is a musician, an educator, and the author of 17 beautiful books. If you haven't had a chance to look at the books, they're displayed on a table right when you walk in. They are for sale, and they are absolutely stunning. So please join me in welcoming Marion.
Race to finish. Will we make it? It does not look like if you watch TV. But movements are happening in the right direction. But we've seen it before with Martin Luther King, Louis Riel, Nora Berard, Ann Cools, Chief Dan George, Alanis Obasanjo, and Drake. Indigenous lives matter. Black lives matter. So with time on our side, due to the strange COVID-19 pandemic slowing down the world, let us evaluate what really matters. What do we value? Lives. Let us talk about justice, equality, and human rights. We have time to stand and be the voice for change. Can we race to finish, or will race wars finish humanity? And if you see what's happening in the world today, again, more fighting, it's very important that we continue to work at peace. And Slava Ukraine, again, glory to Ukraine, prayers for Ukraine and peace in the world, but all places. There's many, Israel and all that's happening. So this is the front cover of my book. They say a picture can describe 1,000 words, and I use this as a teaching tool in schools. Before COVID, I was speaking a lot. So what do you think's happening in this book? You'll see Hanusia is writing letters, as I told you before, but you see pictures from the Holodomor happening. And there's the back cover. And Ola did a beautiful job of the cover. And one of the survivors had said, "Wake up, Taras, and look around you, not a cow or pig in sight, nor a morsel to eat, only Stalin's portrait on the wall." Because, you know, as communism was spreading, and he wanted to spread in communism, his picture was everywhere. So I created 2 symbolic characters based on my research. and one is Bodan, which means gift from God. That's the grandfather. And the other's granddaughter is Hanka or Hanusia. And in my book, the grandfather's village gets wiped out during the Holodomor. And this happened. As I said, it took me 4 years to write this book. I did a lot of research to make sure it was as accurate as it could be. And this area was in the Donetsk area near the Azov Sea. And I used this purposely because this village became a ghost town. It was totally wiped out. Now, after the Holodomor, the Russians went and put Russians in those villages. But they wouldn't stay in those houses because they said the stench was so bad and so much death, they couldn't even handle it. And that, again, is based on research. But a lot of villages were wiped out. So the maps of the area. So there's 1932 is when the Holodomor took place, the main crunch of most people dying, 1932 to 33. And Lviv area, Western Ukraine, is where my ancestors came from. The Sokol region, and two villages, Peresipa and Zubkova, and Kiev is there. But their Donetsk area is where a lot of the Holodomor took place. Luckily, my grandparents had already left at this time, 1911 and 12. But I do have relatives that still live in Ukraine, and some are fighting in the war. So areas affected by the Holodomor. And you can see it on the map. The area is all in gray. And the current state borders of Ukraine at that time in 1930. And again, the borders, if you look at the map of Ukraine, it's changing again, right? Ukraine has been conquered. So many people want Ukraine. It's a beautiful place. I was there in 2009 with my three sisters. We went and saw where our ancestors came from. And it is so beautiful there. But everybody wants to take it over all the time because it has so many resources, just like Canada. Again, 25% of the people were killed in that area. Just showing where the red is. 1 in 4. Many of them were children first. And the death toll was per 1,000 people. So you see the red again. So there's Lviv again, and there's the eastern part of Ukraine. The area close to where they're fighting now again. And this is the different regions. And every region in Ukraine has different cultural, they have similarities, but they also have different cultural things and different blouses and embroidery we were just talking about borscht. There's green borscht, and I don't know what plant it's made from, but my mom never made green borscht because we never had that plant, but there are certain areas in Ukraine where they make green borscht. Anybody had green borscht? No? I've tried it, but we never made it. So what was the Holodomor? Well, if you're a journalist, what I'm going to tell you about is the 5 W's. You know, how did it happen? Who, what, where, when, and why. And sometimes how, right? Before I did all this research, you know, it's like residential schools. I grew up in Saskatchewan. I lived here my whole life, but I never even heard about it. As a matter of fact, I started teaching in 1979 in Prince Albert and at St. Anne's School. And on that property, there was another school. And I said to the teachers, this is 1979, I said, what's that school for? And they says, oh, that's where the indigenous people go. And I said, really? I said, why don't they come to our school? I had no idea about residential schools. And that was in 1979, you know. Everything was kept a secret. Well, same with the Holodomor. It wasn't until the 80s they started talking about it. And even when I went in 2009 to visit relatives in Ukraine, because they'd been under communist rule for so long, they didn't have freedom of speech. And you talk to them and they say, why do you want to know that for? And they didn't want the pictures taken because they were so suspicious. Because if you imagine being under observation your whole life, that would make you very suspicious of your neighbors, about everyone. So it's growing up in that atmosphere. We are so lucky to have the freedoms in Canada to talk and not be suspicious of everyone. But Holodomor means death or murder by forced starvation. Holod means hunger and famine, or morche means death or torment, and that's what happened. It's a Ukrainian word, murder by starvation. And it's a genocide. Now, do Putin or the Russians recognize it as that? No, but it is. And it has been declared that, and it was led by Joseph Stalin in the early 1930s. He wanted to take over all of Ukraine and make it communist. And it's believed anywhere from 4.5 million to possibly 10 million Ukrainians died. Now, why don't they know? Because first of all, Russians wouldn't give them the documents or the statistics about it, but also they don't know because so many people died, right? So how do you know? But the government has recognized the fourth Saturday in November as the International Day of Remembrance for Ukrainians who perished during the Holodomor. And there's statues in Regina and Saskatoon and around the world recognizing the Holodomor. So wheat, we talked about this last night, how important to Ukrainians bread is. You know, you had some beautiful bread this morning, right? How delicious and important. Because, especially the ones that came, and there was a lady here, I don't know if she's here today, she asked, how long have they been farming in Ukraine? I don't know the answer to that. Does anyone know? We'd have to Google it. But the first Ukrainians that came here were all farmers, right? That's why they came to farm the land in Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba. A lot of them settled in that area, and they were all farmers. After that, there's like 5 waves of Ukrainian people coming after other classes of people came in different jobs, but the first group were farmers, just like my grandparents and my parents too. And rye bread, very, again, important to Ukrainian people. It's a source of life. And a lot of their dances, a lot of their traditions are based on their bread. Beautiful bread. So, hunger. This old expression, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. Well, literally they did. They ate horses to survive. Sorry?
Apparently in Canada, in British Columbia, they ate horse too. My husband said they did.
Okay, because they were so hungry?
No, they just sold it.
Okay. Well, it could be true. I don't know that. I haven't done any research on it. You've had horse meat?
Because my mother worked at the horse plant.
Okay. In Ukraine, they had to eat anything they could find, and they did eat horses. You know, have you ever been, how long have you been hungry? You know, imagine starvation and the long-term effects of starvation. And I use Anne Applebaum's book, The Red Fife, to do my research. She won a Pulitzer Prize. It's about 600 pages. I had to skim read the parts about starvation, because what happens to you as you starve to death, you know, your body, it's really horrific. I could only write about it. I couldn't think about it. If you understand what I'm talking about, because you can't think of something so horrific happening to these people. But if you ever get a chance to read that book, and on page 61, well, maybe I'll read that to you, what they ate to stay alive. I've got this bad habit of putting my glasses down and never finding them.
Marion?
Anybody have that habit? I should put them on a string.
Marion, I was going to tell you something.
Okay.
You know what I heard when I was up in Edmonton one time?
What?
I was talking to Olga, and she said, if the bread gets stuck to the ceiling, you're supposed to have a good wife after you get married to her.
Oh, well, it could be. I know at Christmas time, they put kucha, the wheat, on the ceiling, and that means you're going to have good luck.
Good luck. And
Good
you're
luck.
supposed to have a wife that's happy and treating you good all the time.
Well, that's a good thing. There you go. We ate, so I'm going to talk about what they ate. We ate anything we could stomach and get our hands on, even slurping pig slop from a common cauldron. Potatoes, milled acorn, horseradish, scraps, pigweed, rabbit, squirrels, and anything burrowing animal. Some people even ate weeds with no flour, just a mixture of weeds and crushed straws made into patties. If a horse dropped dead, it was burned to try and get rid of disease, and then cooked and eaten later. However, many people then became infected with glander's disease, an infectious disease that is caused by the bacteria when eating dead horses. If we tried to eat the wheat stalks on the fields, we were shot. One of the last items Taras and I ate before leaving Ukraine was a porcupine. And as I ate it, I imagined the scent of delicious food. Survivors had huge swollen bellies. So often you see in those pictures of people starving in Africa, and they have huge bellies. That's what happens when you starve to death. Our arms and legs looked like scary skeletons, our skin translucent over pallid faces, our eyes bulging in crazed from terror. We looked like corpses, and death was desirable. I felt we were artificial orphans, as the starvation was purposely caused by Stalin in the name of universal collectivization. And the world seemed indifferent to this disaster. I'm sorry to be gruesome after you've just eaten at lunch. So who was responsible? Who were the key players? Joseph Stalin. He had a 5-year plan, and it was engineered by him. And he actually was not Russian, he was Georgian. And he was the leader. And he had help, Lazar Kaganovich, the administrator. And obviously they have help, just like Putin has help. He wouldn't be in power if he didn't have help. There are people helping him, just like Hitler had help. Things don't happen on their own. And the journalists were either blackmailed, bribed, not to write about the Holodomor. There's a movie out called Mr. Jones. I think you can watch it on Netflix. And it was a journalist that actually did speak about the Holodomor. But they were threatened, or probably, the families were threatened if they wrote about it. And the doctors were told to write digestive element on death certificates. And the leaders turned a blind eye. Because Stalin was shipping, it was not like they didn't have wheat. They had tons of wheat. They were shipping it to the Western world. So why was the reason it happened? Well, they were forced to join the Soviet Union. Ukraine did not want to join, but Stalin wanted to get rid of the Ukrainian bourgeoisie, nationalism. He wanted to actually wipe out all the educated Ukrainians and all the culture. And he arrested, deported, and executed anybody with cultural, religious, and political leaders to take complete control of Ukraine. His policy of collectivization and communism by the USSR and starvation of Ukrainians was his way of not losing Ukraine to independence. And he tried to bring Ukraine to its knees. And he's still trying to do it today, Putin. So in the name of communism, he wanted the land. And if you didn't sign up or give the land over, eventually you got it anyway, because they starved you to death and took it over. And as I said, Ukraine is like Canada, has so many resources, beautiful resources. It's known as the breadbasket at one time of Europe, so it could feed people. So what was the cause? What happened during the Holodomor? Well, agriculture again. The Soviet state owned everything, and when the Ukrainian farmers resisted, they took their property, they were forced into collective farms, and Stalin and his soldiers carried out the Holodomor to punish the Ukrainian farmers, and they were called the Kurkuls, or the kulaks in Russians, and they wanted to get rid of any opposition to communism, or collectivization and Soviet rule. And anyone that stood in the way were basically shot. Even in Russia today, that's happening. Anyone that goes against Putin, they shoot them, right? Probably the same sort of thing. Anyone that speaks out, even the leaders, right, they're put in jail. So how was it carried out? Well, he set grain quotas for the farmers, and they took all the grain, even the seeds. And then the troops would search your houses, taking your wheat and food, leaving the people hungry. And Russia sold millions of tons of wheat to Western countries during the Holodomor. They closed the borders, they closed the towns, they wouldn't let you out of your place. Anyone going to the cities to look for food, they would not let you leave your village. So 5 ears of wheat. So in my book, Ola made this beautiful 5 ears of wheat, and that's a symbol for wheat and what happened. Because if you were caught eating even 1 grain of wheat, you were shot. And they're wrapped in black ribbon. It's a sign. So the law of 5 years of grain in August 7th, 1932, implemented by Stalin, which said you could be imprisoned for 10 years or even shot for simply eating stalks of grain. And bread was used as a weapon of genocide. And as you know, to many people, bread is your fabric of life, right? A staple. So what was the impact? Well, Ukrainians died at a rate of 30,000 people per day in June 1933. 1 in 4 died, starved to death, not just died, but starved to death. And the 1937 Soviet census showed a sharp decrease in the Ukrainian population, so that's one way they could figure it out, how many people died. But he also shot anyone who allowed census information to be released to the public. So after 50 years, Soviets denied the Holodomor, and even today, as I said before, they still deny it happened, that it was not a genocide, it did not happen. But there are survivors, and there are people that know, and people that escaped and wrote about it. And even in Hafford, Saskatchewan, where my mom is from, they had meetings in their their museum or whatever, town hall, and people, you know, because people had family back there, and they were sending letters and telling them what was happening secretly, right? So they heard about it from family members. So what is a genocide? Well, the Geneva Convention said it's a criminal act with the intention of destroying a national, ethnic, or religious group and targeted as such. So it is considered a genocide. And these are some other genocides, and there's still others happening today, right? So why am I here? Why am I teaching about this? Well, as I said last night, I sign all my books, Peace, Marion, Mutala. My books now, after 13 years I've been writing. I was a teacher for 30 years, and then my first book came out in 2009. And at first I just wanted to write and share my stories and document the traditions. But now they're tools of peace, because I feel it's important that we work for peace, and so that these genocides aren't repeated, right? We need to speak up as human beings, as humanitarians, and honor those that lost their lives. And maybe some of you have relatives that were there. The same with their display, that your new, what's that called? Enemy aliens. I don't know if my grandfather came in 1911. That took place in 1914, but because Ukraine was part of the Austria-Hungarian Empire, they were considered enemy aliens at the start of World War I. A lot of them came to escape bad times. Doesn't mean that they were part of the war or even knew about what was going on in Europe at that time when they escaped, but they were put in concentration camps because they had no choice, because they considered them enemy aliens. And people didn't talk about that either. So there's 4 men on the front cover of my book at the top, and this was a propaganda poster that they had from left to right of Karl Marx was the father of communism, and Friedrich Engels was a philosopher, and in 1848 he wrote the book The Communist Manifesto. Maybe some of you have read it. Vladimir Lenin, and he was leader before Stalin, changed Russia to the Soviet Union, and then Joseph Stalin was the leader from 1924 to 1953, and now Putin has made himself leader for the rest of his life, right? He put in that new policy that he's there forever. So this image was very popular during, and placed on posters, propaganda material. So what is communism? Well, it's an ideology and a type of government in which the state owns everything, and including your property. And that means anything you produce, they educate you, anything to do with agriculture and transportation. So basically, it proposes a society in which everyone shares the benefits of labor equally and eliminates the class system. Now, on paper, it looks good, right? You know, it's kind of a utopia, right? But you know in practice it doesn't work. And because the people at the top are always, you know, you look at Putin, he's a billionaire. He stole everything from Ukraine and all over the world. You think he believes in communism and sharing? Okay, so I'm going to read you a few of my letters, but I talk about the art of letter writing. I know when this first book came out, people said to me, why didn't you have them texting each other? Because that's what people do nowadays. Well, how many of you still write letters and like to get letters in the mail? It's kind of a lost art. And so because grandfather was 90 in his 90s when I wrote this book, or supposedly, that's why I decided to use letter writing, because I think it would be more suitable for grandpa, even though Hanusia would probably prefer texting. And it's dedicated to the millions of voices from the Ukrainian genocide and to the Holodomor stories and survivors and their family. So now their story is told, it's not forgotten. And my book is used in schools now to teach and in other places. So it's very important. I'm glad I wrote it. It was a very difficult passage. Has anybody written anything really difficult, you know, historical fiction or fiction? You know, you create a character or characters that are fiction, but then the story is true, right? And that's very hard, especially about difficult topics. And Arthur Slade, who's an author, said, this book brings an important historical story to vivid life. It's heartbreaking, touching, and necessary reading, a tale that artfully bridges the gap between generations. And Dr. Bill Gulka is the one that, he's a professor at the university, that asked me to write this book. He said, no Holodomor or genocide should ever happen. It is inhumanity to humanity. By humanity, we cannot undo the Holodomor perpetrated against Ukrainians and other peoples of the former Soviet Union. However, we must not allow this terrible event to remain forgotten. And so this allows people to know what happened. And there's a memorial statue. So you see the girl, starving girl. It's often used around the world.
Where is that?
That one might be in Regina. I have to go back and think where I got that. Maybe I have it in my notes. Let's see. But there's very similar ones. So there's that movie I talked about, Mr. Jones. And so in 1991, as you know, Ukraine became independent, right? Or tried to be independent and just wants to live in peace. And they just want to, you know, it's an justifiable war again. Okay, and for those of you that weren't here last night, or for some of you were, those are my grandparents. So that's my baba, Tessie Wozniakowski. She came to Canada from Zubkova in the western part of Ukraine in 1912. And my grandfather, my Dido, Stefan Dubik. I didn't know my Dido, he died before I was born. My grandmother died when I was 4, so I didn't know her very much, but I have 9 brothers and sisters that told me about her. And what's significant about her is she's wearing a babushka. So that was the inspiration for my writing. And if you see all my beautiful babushkas over there, they were mums. I have a babushka that matches each of my books, my other books that I wrote. So just telling you for those that weren't here last night. And there's my mom and dad. They were married in 1940. My dad was from Slovakia. It was Czechoslovakia when he came to Canada, but now it's Slovakia. And he didn't have any family here, but he lived by Hanley Kenniston. And so when mom married dad, she moved from Hafford to Hanley Kenniston. Sophie and August Mutala. And they were married 40-some years and 10 children. I'm number 9 out of 10. And there's my grandson, and this is the reason I still talk about these things, because you know, you might have family members. What kind of future do you want for people in your lives? Oliver, he's so cute, he's starting to walk. And there's my family, my daughter Natasha, her partner Robert, me, Sim and Shyla, and my one son. There he is, JJ, on this side. And Ola did the wheat. She's originally from Ukraine. She came to Saskatoon and worked at the museum and gave me her business card, luckily. And then she moved to Toronto to be close to her mom. And she's trained as an artist and does a beautiful job. Her illustrations are beautiful. Ola Tachenko. And there I am. Okay. Do you have any questions that you want to talk about the Holodomor before I do a little reading about it? I don't know. Sorry, I can't hear you.
That should be happening to Ukraine, don't it? Repeat of history.
I think so. History is repeating itself. Like Ukraine.
I didn't hear.
History is repeating itself.
History is repeating itself, isn't it? And unfortunately, right? And what can we do to stop it? I don't know.
Canada said Canada told us what to do.
Yeah, it's very sad, very sad. I'm sorry to bring such a sad story to you, but it's important that we talk about these things so we can change and do something. Yes?
I do think about that repeating history often, and I think one of the problems is the humans are very susceptible to bias. And you know, we focus on the trauma. I've come to believe there's no such thing as victims, just cause and effect. And you know, I wonder about that impact, because you talked last night about Christianity being big in Ukraine. But from what I remember about teachings is there was this parable about kind of trust God will provide, and I feel like almost agriculture is saying, screw you God, I can do it better. And I wonder about the impacts of that and leading to starvation, where we've essentially put ourselves at this whim of this production system that really contravenes any laws of nature and how agriculture has impacted societies. Like, you gave an acknowledgement for Indigenous and Blacks. Well, Black people were brought into slavery to work on farms and plantations. Indigenous were displaced and essentially destroyed due to agriculture. So, you know, I contemplate when we want to learn from history, we have to overcome our own biases and, you know, look at history with a lot more rigorous honesty if we really want to solve our problems.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, I call myself a back to the lander.
Yeah.
Thinking
Well,
about
you know, and it's great, and farms and people, like during COVID, for example, started growing gardens again, but you know, that didn't last very long, right? And even bread makers, you know, people started making bread like crazy and buying bread makers, but then again, that didn't last very long, you know, so when you talk about, like, I grew up in a farm, like by Hanley, Keniston. My mom grew huge farm, you know, garden, huge garden, like, you know, probably the size of this was just in corn alone. This size of this room was in potatoes, you know, and she was hungry. My mom was born in 1918, and she had been through the war, and also through the Depression, the Great Depression, which, you know, and was hungry many times. They had large sandwiches and all kinds of stuff, like, and tea, you know, but I was lucky. You know, I grew up and we had a huge farm and we had pigs and cows and chickens, so we were never hungry. The only thing we had to buy was sugar and tea and coffee, really. You know, we didn't have a lot of material things, but we didn't need a lot of material things then. Everybody was the same and poor. And she would grow these gardens and give the produce away. You know, there was people that didn't have. But not everyone's willing to grow gardens anymore. So I don't know what the solution is. Yes?
Hi, my name is Christine.
Hi, Christine.
Grateful to meet you.
Yes, thank you.
My invitation, I think, from all of this, and just the state of the world and the wars that are happening with lots of countries, including Palestine and Israelis, is we're creating history right now. And we're part of history right now. And so I've been really called. I'm grateful that you're here. I think knowing our roots, I'm Ukrainian. My dad grew up in Blind Lake. You probably knew my baba. Like who we are and where we're from is important. And at the same time, our neighbors on the other side of the world are also part of humanity. So all of these stories, for me, are calling all of us into deep self-reflection on who am I being? Who am I being today? And how can I actually be a peacemaker in the world? And it's easy to get overwhelmed. I'm very moved by what's happening in the world.
It is, it's very sad.
And yes, we can say history is repeating itself, but I'm part of it right now. And all of us here right now are part of a moment where we get to choose how we want to create a beautiful world for everyone. And I'm grateful that people are here and they're learning about the history of the people of this province, which impacts the people in Ukraine, because we're a really large Ukrainian community in Saskatchewan. And I'm just, my hope is that this presentation with you invites all of us here to really be moved in reflecting on who are you being and how can you be a peacemaker in the world.
Yeah, and I believe that firmly. Peace begins with each one of us. And my personal philosophy, because now I'm a Baba and I feel myself a little bit of wisdom, is kindness goes a long way. And so I don't have a lot of rules and things about life, but I know that kindness. And so in your own neighborhood or where you live, wherever that happens to be, because we can't solve the world's problem, but if we can do something in where we are, and that's where we start anyway. And last night, and some of you are here from last night, I was calling some of you to become politicians because we need some good politicians. We need some good people, right, to step up and start speaking for individual people, right? And
we can all do that, and we're not politicians.
yes, and that's right, and start movements and things. And so, yes, there's a little peace movement. I started Ma and Pa for Peace, Mothers Against War, people against war, that kind of thing. Yes?
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I have a wonderful global peacemaker sitting right next to me here. Anyway, my question is, that is a babushka, and it is worn around the head.
Yes.
Okay, can you tell me the origin of wearing it around the head? Is it because of the heat working in the fields, or what?
Okay, good question. So this babushka is very interesting. The history of wearing headscarves, because it's a headscarf, right, is long. It's ancient. If you look at ancient biblical times, somebody always wore on the head. Now, there were practical reasons, because from the heat or working in the fields or whatever. There were religious reasons, because you had to cover your head to go to church. And then there was other reasons just for fashion. And we called it, in my family, because I'm talking about my roots, a babushka. The real word, or they say is fuska or huska in Ukrainian, but my ancestors never called it that. And in the Russian word, babushka means old woman. Now, we had this discussion last night. Where it came from, who knows? All I can say, and even people in Eastern Canada, and this lady actually phoned me and said, why am I calling, because my books are called Baba's Babushka, A Magical Ukrainian Christmas, Easter Wedding. Why am I calling it a Russian word? And I said, well, it's not a Russian word. My mom called it a babushka. Now, the other interesting thing is, when my first book came out, Baba's Babushka, A Magical Ukrainian Christmas, this indigenous fellow said to me, babushka, papushka, that's a Cree word. It means she is wearing. And what do you notice about the kukums? The kukums are the indigenous grandmothers. They wear babushkas. So then I came up with my 4th book in the series, Kukum's Babushka, A Magical Ukrainian Métis Tale, because I noticed that people have more in common than you think, right? And the Métis people have embroidered, just like Ukrainians, fiddle, spiritual life. People have more in common than you think. Even if you go to Mexico, I had this pair of earrings, and everybody said, oh, where'd you get those nice earrings? From Mexico, and they look just like Ukrainian earrings. You know, there's so much cross-cultural things. Food, money. Okay, the most famous food in Canada, and they did a survey, was pierogies. Well, why is it so popular? Because many cultures have a pierogi of some sort, a dumpling. You know, so we have so much in common. Maybe that's a way we can solve problems in human nature, finding out what we have in common instead of what we have in different. You know, so anyway, you're asking why they wore them. Well, my mom, they wore different colors for, you know, fashion too. But the history is, and this I can document, is when a woman got married, she no longer wore the little vinoch, the flowered thing on her head. She wore a babushka, and they actually have a ceremony around it where they will take down her hair and her braids up and put on a babushka. So that's, married women wore them historically, the babushkas. Does that answer your question? And if anyone knows anything more about it, you can tell me, but that's what I've learned in my research. And I actually do consult a lot of people when I do my writing, even though my books, like my first book was Baba's Babushka, A Magical Ukrainian Christmas. It's the story of Natalia, who's a little girl who's actually me in the story. She's out playing in the snow, and a babushka lands on her head, swoops her up, takes her back to Ukraine. She meets her Baba, and her Baba teaches her all the Ukrainian Christmas Eve traditions, Sviat Večer, which are true, with the 12 meatless dishes and bread and kucha and all that. And so that's where I came up, and the reason I came up with the idea is because my grandmother, who I didn't know, she died when I was 4, but she had a babushka on, and my mom had that picture. And I thought, I wonder why she has a babushka on. I wonder what their life was like, you know? And that inspired me to write the stories. And now I'm putting them all on Amazon under my publishing company because I want them to be preserved for future generations so that people know about the traditions and how important they are. Traditions make you who you are. You know, you are who you, a certain way. You do things a certain way because of your roots. You might not like your roots. Some people don't like their families, right? That's true. But you are genetics. You can't get away from genetics. That's who you are. So take the good in your genetics and share it with the world. This is what I talk about in schools, is what a different world we'd have if everyone found out what you're good at and you developed it and shared it with the world, right? That would make a different world. That'd make a completely different world. And so that's what you need to do. And so you need to put yourself out there. And I said, if you want to change your life, write a book. But you don't even have to write a book to share with the world. You could just write a book to share with your family, to teach your children, to teach other people. Because if you learn about my culture, I learn about your culture, it makes the world a better place. We have respect and tolerance for other people. And my Kukum's Babushka is being made into a play in Edmonton. And I work with the Indigenous community now. We're hoping to do a dance, a reconciliation dance around that book, because there's so much commonality between Indigenous people and Ukrainian people. My mom told me that my Baba would always have a pot of tea on and bread. Indigenous people would come and they would share bread and fish back and forth. And obviously we shared the babushkas because they call them the Kukum scarf. And when the war started in Ukraine, the Indigenous people were on our side, and the guys, the warriors, were wearing the babushka as a headband, you know, and they call them Kukum scarves. And if you see any art, they always have a babushka there with their art and their stones. So there's got to be a huge connection, something symbolic to that scarf that is ancient, in my opinion. And I could be wrong, but I feel that. Good questions, though. Anything else?